Keanu Reeves needed a break. His days were often filled with loud sets, flashing cameras, and scripts. Today, he just wanted some peace. He found himself strolling through a quiet park. The sun was low, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Birds chirped, and the occasional breeze rustled the leaves. It was perfect. As he walked along the gravel path, something caught his eye. A stray dog emerged from the bushes ahead, its fur a messy mix of brown and black. It wasn't the dog itself that made him stop. It was the strange key hanging around its neck. The key wasn't ordinary. It was old, large, and rusted, almost like something out of an antique shop. It swung back and forth as the dog padded closer. Kenny crouched, curious, and held out his hand. "Hey there, buddy. Where'd you get that?" The dog tilted its head, as if it understood him, but didn't come closer. Instead, it let out a sharp bark and turned, trotting down the path. Kenny frowned. Something about the dog felt unusual. Without thinking, he started following it. "Wait up," he called, his boots crunching on the gravel as he picked up his pace. The dog didn't stop. It darted through the park, weaving through trees and bushes, and every few moments, it looked back to make sure Kenny was still following. Kenny chuckled under his breath. "All right, I'll bite. Where are we going?" The chase led him to the edge of the park, where the dog slipped through a break in the fence. On the other side was an alley, narrow, dark, and quiet. Kenny hesitated for a moment, looking around. It wasn't the kind of place he usually found himself in, but curiosity got the better of him. The dog barked again, urging him on, and Kenny squeezed through the gap in the fence. He followed the dog down the alley, past dumpsters and faded graffiti on the walls. The smell wasn't pleasant, but he pressed on, his eyes fixed on the key swinging around the dog's neck. After a few turns, the alley opened up into an empty lot. At its center stood an old, abandoned house. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the front door hung slightly ajar. The dog stopped at the entrance, looking back at Kenny as if waiting for him to catch up. Kenny approached cautiously. "You live here or something?" he muttered, glancing at the dilapidated structure. The dog barked twice, then trotted inside. Kenny sighed. "Guess I'm going in." The air inside was stale, and the floor creaked under his weight. Dust coated every surface, and faint beams of light streamed through gaps in the boarded-up windows. The dog moved with purpose, its claws clicking against the wooden floor as it led Kenny deeper into the house. In the living room, Kenny spotted what looked like a trapdoor in the floor. It was secured with a rusty padlock. The dog sat beside it, wagging its tail and staring at him. Kenny raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me." He crouched beside the trapdoor and looked at the lock, then at the key around the dog's neck. "You want me to open this, don't you?" The dog barked once, a sharp, clear sound, as if it was saying yes. Kenny reached for the key. The dog didn't flinch as he unclipped it from the makeshift collar around its neck. The metal felt cold and heavy in his hand. He fit it into the lock, and with a bit of effort, the rusty padlock clicked open. He pulled the trapdoor up, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down. A faint draft carried the scent of damp earth. Kenny hesitated. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. But then he looked at the dog, sitting calmly beside him, as if it was completely confident in what was about to happen. "All right," Kenny muttered. "Let's see what's down there." He turned on the flashlight on his phone and started down the staircase. The dog followed closely, its footsteps almost silent. The walls were rough stone, and the air grew colder with each step. Kenny's flashlight illuminated strange symbols carved into the walls, circles, lines, and shapes he didn't recognize. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage opened up into a small, dusty room. Old wooden crates and metal shelves lined the walls, covered in cobwebs. In the center of the room was something that didn't belong, a modern reinforced metal door with a keypad beside it. Kenny approached the door, shining his flashlight over its surface. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered. The dog barked softly, as if answering him. Kenny looked down at it, then back at the door. Something told him this was just the beginning. Kenny stared at the metal door in front of him. It looked out of place in the dusty, underground room. The keypad beside it was clean and modern, a sharp contrast to the ancient carvings on the walls. He ran his fingers over the door, wondering how it ended up here. The dog barked softly, breaking his thoughts. It nudged his leg and then turned its attention to the corner of the room. Kenny followed its gaze and noticed a small locked crate. It was made of sturdy wood, reinforced with iron straps, and looked like it had been there for years. "You want me to open that too?" Kenny asked, smirking. The dog wagged its tail in response. Kenny knelt beside the crate, giving it a once-over. The lock was old and rusty, but it didn't look like it would put up much of a fight. He found a metal bar nearby and used it to pry the lock loose. After a bit of effort, the lock snapped open and the lid creaked as he lifted it. Inside, he found a small leather pouch and a notebook. its pages yellowed with age. The pouch contained another key, this one smaller, more polished, and engraved with strange symbols. The notebook was filled with scrawled handwriting, but most of it was too faded to read. However, a single phrase jumped out at him. "The key opens the path to the truth." Kenny frowned, holding the smaller key up to the light. It felt important, like it belonged to something bigger than he could imagine. He pocketed it and turned back to the metal door. "Let's see if this gets us anywhere," he muttered, inserting the smaller key into the keypad slot. It fit perfectly. A series of beeps followed, and the door hissed open. Behind it was a tunnel, long, dark, and lined with faintly glowing markings on the walls. The air was damp and carried a metallic tang. The dog took the lead again, moving with a sense of purpose. Kenny followed, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tunnel twisted and turned, each step taking them deeper underground. Kenny's nerves were on edge, but the dog seemed completely calm. He couldn't help but feel like it knew exactly where they were going. After what felt like hours, they reached the end of the tunnel. A wooden door, heavily reinforced with iron bars, stood in their way. A small keyhole was set into the center, and the markings on the walls seemed to converge around it, forming intricate patterns. Kenny pulled out the smaller key and hesitated for a moment. "You sure about this, buddy?" he asked the dog. It barked once, its tail wagging, urging him on. With a deep breath, Kenny inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a room that took his breath away. The space was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The walls were lined with rows of glowing crystals, their light illuminating shelves filled with ancient artifacts and documents. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it was a single item, a rusted, ornate box. Its surface was engraved with the same strange symbols he'd seen earlier. The dog walked straight to the pedestal, sitting beside it as if guarding the box. Kenny approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. "What's in there?" he murmured, reaching out to touch the box. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a sharp jolt shot through his hand. He yanked it back, shaking his fingers. "Well, that's new." The dog barked sharply, almost as if warning him. Kenny frowned, studying the box more carefully. He noticed a small slot on its side, just big enough for the smaller key he'd found earlier. "All right," he said, his voice low. "Here goes nothing." He inserted the key into the box and turned it. A faint hum filled the air, and the box began to glow. Slowly, its lid opened, revealing a folded piece of paper and a tiny metallic cue. Kenny unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the handwritten text. It was a set of instructions, cryptic but clear enough to understand. The cue, it seemed, wasn't just a simple artifact. It was something much more dangerous. "The cube holds the power to rewrite everything," he read aloud. "Use it wisely, or don't use it at all." He looked down at the tiny cube in his hand. It felt heavier than it looked, almost as if it carried the weight of whatever it could do. Kenny glanced at the dog, which stared back at him with its calm, knowing eyes. "All right, pal," Kenny said, slipping the cube into his pocket. "Looks like we're in for a wild ride." The dog barked in agreement, and the two of them turned back toward the tunnel, ready to face whatever came next. The air in the tunnel felt heavier as Kenny and the dog moved forward. The glowing markings on the walls seemed to pulsate faintly, like they were alive. Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every so often, he glanced over his shoulder, but the darkness behind him was still. The dog led the way confidently, its paws making barely a sound on the cold stone floor. Kenny followed, gripping the flashlight tightly in one hand and keeping the other near the pocket where he placed the cue. He couldn't explain it, but the cube felt warm now, almost as if it was responding to something. "Where are we going?" Kenny muttered, more to himself than to the dog. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning, with no sign of an end. Yet the dog showed no hesitation. It moved with purpose, its nose low to the ground, sniffing occasionally. After what felt like hours, they reached a fork in the tunnel. Two paths stretched ahead, identical in every way. Kenny stopped, shining his flashlight down each path, but there was no indication of which one to take. "Well, buddy, looks like it's your call," he said, looking down at the dog. The dog sniffed the ground, then barked sharply, choosing the path on the left. Kenny followed without question. The air grew colder as they continued, and the faint metallic tang in the air became stronger. Kenny's grip tightened on the flashlight, his nerves on edge. The tunnel finally opened into a larger chamber. The walls were lined with more of the glowing symbols, and in the center of the room was something unexpected. A large reinforced metal door, much like the one they had seen earlier. This one, however, was surrounded by a series of intricate locks and gears, each glowing faintly. Kenny approached cautiously, inspecting the door. "Looks like we're not getting through this one easily," he muttered. The dog sat beside him, staring at the locks as if it was studying them. As Kenny examined the mechanisms, he noticed something odd. One of the locks had a small indentation, shaped exactly like the cue he found earlier. He hesitated, pulling the cube from his pocket. It felt even warmer now, almost like it was urging him to use it. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's see what you can do." He placed the cue into the indentation. The moment it clicked into place, the room filled with a low hum. The gears around the door began to turn, and the glowing symbols on the walls pulsed brighter. Slowly, the massive door creaked open, revealing another dark passage beyond. Kenny stepped back, watching as the dog moved forward without hesitation. "Guess we're going in," he muttered, following close behind. The passage beyond the door was narrow and steep, leading them deeper underground. The glowing symbols were gone now, replaced by smooth, unmarked stone walls. Kenny's flashlight flickered, and he gave it a sharp tap to keep it on. The cue was back in his pocket, but its warmth lingered, a constant reminder of its presence. At the end of the passage, they reached another door, this one smaller and simpler. Kenny pushed it open cautiously, revealing a room that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Monitors covered the walls, their screens flickering with static. A single desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers, files, and what appeared to be a recording device. The dog barked softly, drawing Kenny's attention to a metal drawer beneath the desk. He pulled it open, finding a folder with his name written in bold letters across the top. His heart raced as he flipped it open. Inside were photos of himself, some recent, others from years ago. One photo showed him in a military uniform, standing beside people he didn't recognize. Another was of him holding a smaller version of the cube, looking grim and focused. The papers were filled with technical jargon and references to something called Project Echelon. "What the hell is this?" Kenny muttered, scanning the documents. One page caught his eye. It was a report detailing a mission he had no memory of. It described a team tasked with recovering an artifact, with Kenny listed as the team leader. The date on the report was from years ago, but he had no recollection of any of it. The recording device clicked, startling him. A voice crackled through the static. "If you're hearing this, it means the cue has found its way back to you. They're coming, Kenny. You need to act fast." Kenny froze, his mind racing. The voice continued, offering no answers, just warnings. "The cube holds the power to rewrite everything. Protect it. Don't let it fall into their hands." The message ended abruptly, leaving Kenny in silence. He looked down at the dog, which was sitting patiently by his side, its calm demeanor unnerving in the face of what he'd just discovered. "They're coming?" Kenny whispered. He stuffed the documents and the recording device into his backpack, then turned to the dog. "All right, pal. Looks like we got company." The dog barked sharply, almost like it agreed. Kenny grabbed a metal rod from the corner of the room. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. Together, they headed back toward the passage, ready to face whatever was coming their way. Kenny climbed back through the narrow passage, the dog trotting ahead like it had done this 100 times. His thoughts raced as he pieced together what he'd just learned. The cue wasn't just a relic, it was a tool of unimaginable power. The voice on the recording had made that clear enough, and now someone, or something, was after it. The dog suddenly froze, its ears twitching. Kenny stopped in his tracks, holding his breath. A faint sound echoed down the tunnel, footsteps. Not just one person, multiple. The sharp rhythm of boots on stone reverberated in the still air. Whoever was coming wasn't trying to stay quiet. "Stay close," Kenny whispered to the dog, gripping the metal rod tightly. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly as adrenaline kicked in. He killed the beam, plunging them into darkness. The dog didn't make a sound, but Kenny could feel it press against his leg, steadying him. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. Kenny strained to hear. "Spread out," one of them ordered, his tone cold and commanding. "The artifact has to be here." Kenny cursed under his breath. The men weren't just searching blindly. They knew exactly what they were after. He moved carefully, pressing his back against the wall as the faint glow of flashlights began to illuminate the tunnel ahead. He could make out 3 figures, heavily armed, their faces obscured by helmets. The dog nudged his leg and let out a low growl, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Kenny glanced down at it, then at the men. The dog seemed ready to spring into action, but Kenny shook his head. "Not yet," he mouthed. One of the men stopped and crouched near the ground, examining the faint tracks left by their footsteps. "They're close," he said, pointing forward. Kenny had seconds to act. He spotted a loose chunk of rock on the ground and hurled it down the opposite side of the tunnel. The sound of it clattering against the stone walls made the men whirl around, their weapons raised. "There," one of them barked. As the men moved toward the noise, Kenny tapped the dog's side, signaling it to follow. Together, they slipped into a shadowy crevice, avoiding the beams of light that swept over the walls. Kenny waited until the men had passed, then exhaled quietly. "Smart dog," he muttered, giving it a quick scratch behind the ear. The dog wagged its tail briefly, but its focus quickly returned to the task at hand. They moved swiftly, retracing their steps toward the larger chamber where the tunnel had forked. The glowing symbols on the walls seemed dimmer now, almost as if they were warning him of something. Kenny kept glancing over his shoulder, the distant sound of footsteps reminding him that the men weren't far behind. As they reached the chamber, the dog suddenly sprinted ahead. Kenny called after it in a harsh whisper, but it didn't stop. It darted toward one of the walls, scratching at the surface with urgency. Kenny ran over and saw what had caught the dog's attention, a faint outline of a door, nearly invisible against the stone. Kenny pressed his hand against it, feeling for a mechanism. His fingers brushed over a small indentation, almost like a hidden button. Without hesitation, he pushed it. The door slid open silently, revealing another passage. The dog barked softly and ran inside. Kenny followed, pulling the door closed behind them. The footsteps outside grew louder, but the thick stone muffled the noise. For now, they were safe. "Good call, buddy," Kenny whispered, patting the dog's head. He shone his flashlight down the new passage. This one was narrower, with uneven walls and a ceiling that forced him to crouch slightly. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than facing the armed men. As they moved deeper into the passage, Kenny felt the cube's warmth intensify in his pocket. It was as if it was guiding him, or reacting to something up ahead. He tightened his grip on the metal rod, bracing himself for whatever was next. The passage eventually opened into a cavernous room, its ceiling high and arched. Large stone pillars lined the walls, each one etched with the same glowing symbols that had guided them so far. In the center of the room was a pedestal, similar to the one where Kenny had found the cube. However, this one was empty. Kenny approached cautiously, scanning the room. The dog sniffed the ground, its ears pricked and alert. Something about the space felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. Before Kenny could react, the sound of engines roared from the tunnel behind them. Bright headlights flooded the cavern, followed by the screech of tires. Black SUVs skidded to a halt, and men in tactical gear poured out, their weapons drawn. Keanu Reeves, one of them called, stepping forward. He wasn't wearing a helmet like the others. His face was sharp, his expression cold and calculating. "You have something that belongs to us." Kenny instinctively stepped back, his hand tightening around the cube in his pocket. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man smirked. "We know you found the artifact. Hand it over, and we might let you walk out of here." The dog growled, stepping in front of Kenny as if to shield him. The men raised their weapons, but the leader held up a hand. "Stand down," he ordered. "Let's not make this messy." Kenny's mind raced. He couldn't trust them, and he knew it. The cube wasn't just some artifact. It was dangerous, and these people had no business controlling it. "Sorry," Kenny said, gripping the cube tightly. "I don't think that's going to happen." The leader's smirk faded. "Very well," he said, motioning to his men. "Take him." The room erupted into chaos. Kenny ducked behind one of the pillars as gunfire echoed through the cavern. The dog leaped into action, darting between the men and biting at their legs, causing them to stumble. Kenny swung the metal rod, disarming one of the attackers and grabbing his weapon. Shots ricocheted off the stone walls as Kenny returned fire, using the pillars as cover. The dog's agility was unmatched. It seemed to anticipate every move, staying just out of harm's way while creating distractions. Kenny spotted the leader near the SUVs, barking orders into a radio. He knew he had to act fast. With the dog's help, he fought his way through the chaos, reaching the leader just as he turned to flee. Kenny grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the SUV. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want with the cube?" The leader sneered. "You don't even know what you're holding, do you?" Before Kenny could press further, a loud explosion rocked the cavern. One of the SUVs had been rigged with explosives, and the blast sent debris flying. Kenny ducked, shielding the dog as the room filled with smoke. When the dust settled, the leader was gone, and the remaining men had retreated. Kenny stood, catching his breath, as the dog nuzzled his leg, unharmed but visibly tired. "Guess we got their attention now," Kenny said, gripping the cube. The dog barked softly, and together they stepped into the next passage, ready for whatever came next. Kenny and the dog trudged through the dense forest, guided by the coordinates from the cube and the faint glow it emitted. The chaos of the cavern was behind them, but the tension lingered. Every crunch of a twig or rustle of leaves put Kenny on edge, his grip on the stolen weapon tight. "Just keep moving," he muttered under his breath, as much to himself as to the dog. The dog, ever watchful, stayed by his side, ears perked and tail low. Its sharp instincts had saved him more than once, and Kenny trusted it more than he trusted his own luck. Hours passed before they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a small, unassuming cabin. The roof sagged slightly, and the wood was weathered, but it looked sturdy enough. It was the kind of place no one would think to look, a perfect hideout. "This must be it," Kenny said, glancing down at the dog. It barked once, as if confirming his thoughts. He approached cautiously, scanning the area for traps or signs of activity. The windows were shuttered, and the front door had a rusted padlock. The dog sniffed around the perimeter, returning with no sign of danger. Kenny found a crowbar near the steps and used it to break the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A table, a few chairs, and a wood-burning stove occupied the main room. Dust covered everything, but it looked like no one had been here in years. Kenny closed the door behind him and bolted it before collapsing into a chair. The dog curled up at his feet, finally allowing itself to rest. Kenny placed the cube on the table, its faint glow illuminating the room. He pulled out the documents and recording device he'd taken from the cavern, spreading them out in front of him. The files were dense, filled with technical jargon he could barely decipher. But one document caught his attention, a handwritten note tucked between the pages. It read, "The artifact's location was never random. It was hidden with you because you're the only one who can use it. Protect it at all costs." Kenny leaned back, the weight of those words sinking in. Whoever wrote this knew him, and they trusted him with something incredibly dangerous. He glanced at the dog, which watched him intently, its sharp eyes almost reassuring. "Guess it's just us, huh?" he said with a faint smile. The dog wagged its tail slightly before resting its head on its paws. Among the documents, Kenny found another clue, a crude map marked with an X. It showed a location deep in the mountains, not far from where they were. The map was labeled Final Access Point. "This just gets better and better," Kenny muttered. He folded the map and tucked it into his pocket. His next move was clear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the organization would be waiting for him. He spent the next hour checking the cabin for anything useful. In a closet, he found a hunting rifle and a box of ammunition. There was also a backpack stocked with basic supplies, enough to last a few days. It was almost too convenient, but Kenny wasn't in a position to question it. As he packed, the dog perked up, its ears twitching. A low growl escaped its throat. Kenny froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. Then he heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the forest floor. "They found us," he whispered, grabbing the rifle. The dog moved to the door, its body tense and ready. Kenny extinguished the cube's glow by wrapping it in cloth and tucked it into his bag. He positioned himself near the window, peeking through a crack in the shutters. Shadows moved between the trees, at least 3 figures, heavily armed. The dog let out a soft whine, clearly anxious but holding its ground. Kenny patted its head. "We'll be fine," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The first attacker approached the cabin, raising his weapon to fire. Kenny acted fast, smashing through the window with the rifle and firing a single shot. The man dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the ground. The other 2 men scattered, shouting to each other. Kenny ducked behind the table as bullets tore through the cabin walls. The dog darted through the chaos, slipping out the broken window and vanishing into the trees. "Smart move," Kenny muttered, reloading the rifle. He took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and fired at another shadow, dropping the second attacker. The final man retreated, firing blindly as he disappeared into the forest. Kenny didn't relax until the silence returned. He stood slowly, scanning the area through the shattered window. The dog emerged moments later, unharmed, dragging a small pouch in its teeth. It dropped the pouch at Kenny's feet and wagged its tail. "What's this?" Kenny asked, crouching to open it. Inside were spare rounds and a small electronic device, a tracker. His blood ran cold. "They've been following us," he said, crushing the tracker under his boot. He looked down at the dog. "They won't stop, will they?" The dog barked softly, its steady gaze giving him the resolve he needed. Kenny strapped on the backpack and slung the rifle over his shoulder. "All right, buddy, let's finish this." The map led Kenny and the dog deep into the mountains. The terrain was rough, the air thin and cold. Kenny kept his focus sharp, constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. The dog remained at his side, moving with quiet determination. Hours later, they reached the location marked on the map, a desolate military bunker built into the mountainside. The entrance was reinforced steel, flanked by overgrown bushes and debris. Kenny crouched, examining the area. The bunker looked abandoned, but he knew better than to trust appearances. The dog sniffed around the entrance and growled softly. Kenny nodded. "Yeah, I don't like it either." He pressed his ear to the door, listening for movement. Hearing nothing, he tried the handle. Locked. He pulled the cube from his bag, its glow faint in the dim light. As he approached the door, a small panel slid open, revealing a slot identical to the one in the cavern. Kenny hesitated. If the cube unlocked the door, it could alert anyone inside, but he didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, he inserted the cube. The door rumbled as gears turned and locks disengaged. Slowly, it swung open. The bunker was dark and silent. Kenny stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The walls were lined with control panels and screens, many of them broken or flickering with static. At the center of the room was another pedestal, identical to the one in the cavern. This one held a large metallic sphere, its surface engraved with the same strange symbols. Kenny approached cautiously, but before he could reach the pedestal, the lights flickered on. A loud alarm blared, and the sound of boots echoed through the bunker. "It's a trap," he muttered, spinning around. Armed men poured into the room, weapons raised. The dog growled, standing protectively in front of him. The leader of the organization stepped forward, his cold smirk unmistakable. "You've led us right to it, Mr. Reeves. Thank you." Kenny gritted his teeth, gripping the rifle tightly. "You're not getting it." The leader raised his hand, signaling his men to move in. "Oh, I think we are." What followed was chaos. Kenny fired at the nearest men, taking cover behind a console. The dog darted through the fray, knocking over attackers and biting at their legs. The room was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the shouts of men. Kenny fought with everything he had, but the odds were against him. He glanced at the pedestal, realizing the only way to stop them was to use the artifact. With no time to think, he grabbed the metallic sphere, its surface glowing brighter as he held it. A surge of energy shot through him, and the room froze, literally. Time itself seemed to stop. The men froze in mid-motion. Kenny stumbled back, the sphere pulsing in his hands. The dog barked, unaffected by the strange phenomenon. Kenny didn't understand how it worked, but he knew one thing. The artifact was far more powerful than he'd imagined, and now it was in his hands. Kenny stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, the metallic sphere pulsing faintly in his hands. The world around him was eerily still, the once deafening gunfire now silent. The men who had been closing in on him moments ago were suspended mid-motion, their faces locked in expressions of shock and determination. Even the sparks from the damaged consoles hovered in midair like frozen fireflies. What the hell is this thing?" Kenny muttered, his voice the only sound breaking the silence. His grip on the sphere tightened as he looked down at the dog. It barked once, seemingly unaffected by whatever had stopped time. The dog's calm presence steadied him, pulling his focus away from the overwhelming strangeness of the situation. Kenny carefully set the sphere on the pedestal and stepped back, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The markings on the sphere glowed faintly, casting shifting patterns of light on the bunker walls. He reached for the cube in his pocket, wondering if the two objects were connected. As he brought the cube closer to the sphere, the glow intensified, and the markings began to shift and rearrange themselves. A faint hum filled the air as the symbols on the sphere started to align, forming a map-like projection that hovered above it. Kenny stared at the glowing image, recognizing parts of it immediately. It was the Earth, but there were unfamiliar markers scattered across the map, each glowing with the same light as the sphere. Before he could fully process what he was seeing, the world around him began to move again. The men who had been frozen in time stumbled forward, clearly disoriented. The leader of the organization, who had been mid-stride, regained his balance and looked around in confusion. What just happened? The leader barked, his cold composure faltering for the first time. Kenny didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the sphere and the cube and shoved them into his bag. "Time to go," he muttered, looking at the dog. It barked in agreement, already moving toward the nearest exit. The leader spotted Kenny and shouted, "Stop him." The men snapped out of their confusion and raised their weapons, but Kenny was already on the move. He fired a few shots at the overhead lights, plunging the bunker into darkness. The dog led the way, its sharp instincts guiding them through the maze-like corridors. The sound of boots and shouted orders echoed behind them as Kenny and the dog ran. His heart pounded as he clutched the bag tightly, knowing the artifact in his possession was far more dangerous than he'd realize. If the organization got their hands on it, the consequences would be catastrophic. As they reached the surface, Kenny noticed the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. The bunker door slammed shut behind them, but the sounds of pursuit were still close. He spotted an old dirt bike propped against a nearby shed, clearly abandoned but functional. "Well, I guess we're riding," Kenny said, swinging his leg over the bike. The dog leaped into the sidecar with practiced ease. Kenny kick-started the bike, and the engine roared to life. Without a second thought, he sped off into the dense forest, the branches whipping past them as they raced toward safety. The dirt bike skidded to a halt at the edge of a rocky outcrop overlooking a steep ravine. Kenny killed the engine and scanned the horizon. He could hear the distant hum of drones and the faint roar of engines. The organization wasn't giving up. They were tracking him, and they were close. "All right, buddy," Kenny said, looking down at the dog. "We got one shot at this." He pulled the sphere and cube out of the bag, examining them carefully. The glowing map was still projected above the sphere, the markers pulsing faintly. One marker in particular caught his attention. It was located not far from where they were now. "If this map is right," Kenny muttered, "that's our next stop. But we got to deal with these guys first." The dog barked sharply, its ears swiveling toward the sound of approaching vehicles. Kenny quickly stashed the artifacts back in the bag and scanned the area for cover. He spotted a narrow crevice in the rocks, just big enough for them to hide. They slipped into the crevice just as the first SUV roared into view. Kenny peered out cautiously, counting at least 10 armed men stepping out of the vehicles. One of them carried a small handheld device that beeped rhythmically. "They're tracking the artifacts," Kenny whispered. He glanced at the dog, which stared back at him with unwavering focus. "We've got to lead them away." Kenny picked up a loose rock and hurled it toward a nearby bush. The sound drew the men's attention instantly. "Over there," one of them shouted, and the group moved toward the noise. Using the distraction, Kenny and the dog slipped out of the crevice and made their way toward the marker on the map. They moved quickly but quietly, staying low and using the dense forest for cover. The dog led the way, its sharp senses guiding them through the unfamiliar terrain. As they approached the marker, Kenny noticed something strange. The trees gave way to a clearing, and at its center was an ancient stone structure, an altar of sorts. The markings on the altar matched those on the artifacts, glowing faintly as if reacting to their presence. Kenny approached cautiously, placing the sphere on the altar. The markings flared to life, and the ground beneath him rumbled. The altar split open, revealing a hidden compartment containing another artifact, a small, intricately carved pendant. Before Kenny could grab it, the leader of the organization emerged from the trees, his weapon aimed directly at him. "Step away from the altar, Reeves," he commanded. Kenny slowly raised his hands, glancing at the dog. It growled softly, ready to pounce. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Kenny said, trying to buy time. "These artifacts, they're not just tools. They're alive." The leader sneered. "And that's exactly why they belong to us." Kenny's mind raced. He needed a plan, and fast. His eyes darted to the pendant, which was still glowing on the altar. If he could reach it, maybe it would give him an edge. The leader's men began to close in, their weapons trained on him. Kenny took a deep breath, then shouted, "Now." The dog lunged at the nearest man, knocking him off balance. Kenny dove for the pendant, grabbing it just as the leader opened fire. The moment his fingers touched the artifact, a wave of energy erupted from it, knocking everyone to the ground. Kenny staggered to his feet, the pendant glowing brightly in his hand. The leader looked up at him, his expression a mix of fear and fury. "You don't know what you've done," he shouted. Kenny smirked. "No, but I'm starting to figure it out." With the dog at his side, Kenny turned and ran into the forest, leaving the stunned men behind. The pendant, cube, and sphere pulsed faintly in his bag, their power humming in sync. The game wasn't over yet, but Kenny was ready for whatever came next. Kenny moved swiftly through the dense forest, his breath steady despite the growing tension. The pendant around his neck pulsed faintly, its glow barely visible beneath his shirt. The cube and sphere hummed in his backpack, their combined energy thrumming like a heartbeat. The dog ran at his side, silent and focused, its sharp instincts guiding them away from their pursuers. The leader's words echoed in Kenny's mind. "You don't know what you've done." He didn't know the full extent of it, but one thing was clear: these artifacts were far more powerful than he could have imagined, and they had to be kept out of the organization's hands. The forest gave way to rocky terrain as they ascended a steep incline. According to the map projected by the sphere, their destination wasn't far. Kenny paused at the crest of the hill, scanning the horizon. In the distance, a jagged mountain loomed, its peak shrouded in mist. At its base was a dark opening, another bunker. "Looks like we've got one more stop," Kenny muttered. The dog barked softly, its gaze fixed on the mountain. As they approached, the terrain grew rougher and the air turned colder. Kenny tightened the straps of his backpack, feeling the weight of the artifacts pressing against his shoulders. The pendant's glow intensified slightly, as if reacting to their proximity to the bunker. When they reached the entrance, Kenny crouched behind a boulder, studying the area. The bunker was partially collapsed, with rubble blocking parts of the structure. However, the main door was intact, flanked by motion sensors and surveillance cameras. A small group of armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements precise and methodical. Kenny sighed. "They really don't want anyone getting in there." The dog growled low, its ears twitching as it watched the guards. Kenny patted its head. "All right, buddy, let's do this." Kenny waited until one of the guards turned the corner, leaving a small blind spot in their patrol pattern. Moving quickly and silently, he crept along the shadows, the dog at his side. The pendant's glow grew brighter, but Kenny covered it with his hand, wary of drawing attention. As they neared the door, the faint hum of the security system filled the air. Kenny crouched beside the control panel, examining the keypad and biometric scanner. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the sphere, holding it close to the panel. The markings on the sphere flared to life, and the system let out a soft beep before the locks disengaged. "Not bad," Kenny muttered, slipping inside as the door hissed open. The dog followed, its paws silent on the concrete floor. The interior of the bunker was dark and cold, with flickering emergency lights casting long shadows across the walls. Kenny's footsteps echoed as he moved cautiously down the narrow corridor, his grip on the sphere tight. The pendant pulsed against his chest, and the cube in his bag seemed to vibrate in response. It felt like the artifacts were communicating, guiding him deeper into the bunker. At the end of the corridor, Kenny found another reinforced door, this one adorned with the same glowing symbols etched into the artifacts. He placed the sphere into a slot on the door, and the symbols lit up in sequence. The door rumbled open, revealing a large, circular chamber. The chamber was unlike anything Kenny had seen before. The walls were lined with rows of glowing crystals, each one pulsating faintly. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it rested the final artifact, a sleek, obsidian tablet engraved with intricate patterns. The tablet emitted a faint hum, its surface shimmering like liquid. Kenny approached cautiously, his heart pounding. As he reached for the tablet, the pendant and sphere pulsed violently, and the cube in his bag grew so hot he had to drop the backpack. The artifact's energies converged, and the room filled with a blinding light. Before Kenny could react, the tablet's surface rippled and a holographic projection emerged. The projection showed a map of the Earth, overlaid with glowing lines and symbols. A voice, calm and mechanical, spoke in a language Kenny didn't recognize. "What is this?" he muttered, his eyes scanning the projection. The dog barked, drawing his attention to a section of the map that glowed brighter than the rest. The projection zoomed in, revealing a series of coordinates marked with the same symbols from the artifacts. Kenny realized the significance immediately. The coordinates mark locations across the globe, hidden sites connected to the artifacts. Each site likely held secrets, weapons, or knowledge beyond human understanding. If the organization got their hands on them, it would mean disaster. As the projection faded, Kenny grabbed the tablet and stuffed it into his bag, ignoring the heat radiating from the artifacts. The moment he did, the chamber trembled and a loud alarm blared. "They're here," Kenny said, looking at the dog. It barked sharply, as if to say, "Let's move." They sprinted back toward the entrance, the sound of heady boots and shouting voices echoing behind them. The guards had breached the bunker, their weapons trained on Kenny as he rounded a corner. "Drop the artifacts," one of them shouted. Kenny didn't stop. He grabbed the sphere from his bag and held it high. The markings flared, and a shockwave erupted, sending the guards flying. The dog darted ahead, leading Kenny through the twisting corridors as the bunker began to collapse. Dust and debris filled the air as they burst through the entrance, narrowly avoiding the falling rubble. Kenny skidded to a stop outside, turning to watch the bunker implode. The ground shook violently, and a plume of dust rose into the sky. For a moment there was silence. Kenny doubled over, catching his breath, as the dog sat beside him, panting heavily. "That was too close," Kenny said, looking down at the dog. It wagged its tail weakly, clearly exhausted but still ready for whatever came next. Kenny pulled the tablet from his bag, its surface still glowing faintly. The artifacts were powerful, too powerful, and he knew the organization wouldn't stop until they had them. But for now he had the upper hand. "All right, buddy," Kenny said, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "We've got work to do." The dog barked, and together they disappeared into the forest, the fate of the artifacts and the world resting in their hands. Kenny and the dog moved swiftly through the dense forest, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the collapsed bunker. The artifacts in his bag, now complete with the tablet, pulsed faintly, their combined energy a constant reminder of their immense power. Each step felt heavier, not just from the weight of the bag, but from the responsibility it carried. The early morning light began to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the uneven terrain. Kenny stopped at a small stream to catch his breath and refill his canteen. The dog lapped at the water eagerly, its energy seemingly restored after the chaos of the bunker. Kenny crouched beside the stream, splashing water on his face. "We made it out, but they're not going to stop coming," he muttered. He pulled the tablet from his bag, its surface shimmering with faint patterns. The other artifacts, the cube, the sphere, and the pendant, all seemed to resonate in harmony, their energies aligning. As he studied the tablet, its surface rippled again, projecting another holographic map. This time, the projection zoomed in on a single location, a remote island far from any civilization. The symbols on the map glowed brighter than ever, and Kenny realized what the artifacts were trying to tell him. "This is where it ends," he said, glancing at the dog. It barked once, its sharp eyes locked on him as if it understood. 2 days later, Kenny stood on the deck of a small fishing boat, the island looming in the distance. The journey had been long and fraught with tension. He knew the organization was tracking him, but he had no choice. If the map was right, the island was the key to understanding, and possibly neutralizing, the artifacts. The boat's engine sputtered to a stop as it neared the shore, and Kenny jumped into the shallow water, waiting to land with the dog by his side. The island was wild and untouched, its dense jungle buzzing with the sounds of nature. The pendant around his neck glowed faintly, guiding them toward the center of the island. As they pushed through the thick underbrush, Kenny felt a strange energy in the air. The closer they got to their destination, the stronger the artifact's hum became. Finally, they emerged into a clearing, and Kenny stopped in his tracks. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone structure, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols as the artifacts. It looked ancient, yet it pulsed with a living energy. The structure was shaped like a giant gateway, its towering arches pointing to the sky. In front of it was a pedestal, similar to the ones he'd seen before, but larger and more intricate. "This has to be it," Kenny said, approaching the pedestal. The dog followed, its movements cautious and deliberate. Kenny placed the sphere on the pedestal, followed by the cue and the tablet. The symbols on the structure flared to life, and the ground beneath him rumbled. The gateway began to hum, its arches glowing brighter with each passing second. The artifacts seemed to feed into the structure, their energies merging into a single pulsating rhythm. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the clearing. "That's far enough, Reeves." Kenny spun around to see the leader of the organization emerging from the jungle, flanked by armed men. His smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, determined glare. "You've been a thorn in our side for far too long." Kenny stepped in front of the pedestal, shielding the artifacts. "You don't understand what these things are capable of," he said. "If you take them, you'll destroy everything." The leader raised his weapon. "And if we leave them in your hands, the same could happen. Step aside." The dog growled, baring its teeth, but Kenny held up a hand. He glanced back at the gateway, which was now fully active, its energy spiraling into a glowing vortex. The artifacts seemed to be stabilizing it, preventing its immense power from spilling out uncontrollably. Kenny realized what he had to do. He turned back to the leader, his expression calm but resolute. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me." The leader sneered. "So be it." The clearing erupted into chaos as the leader's men opened fire. Kenny dove behind a fallen log, returning fire with his rifle. The dog darted through the fray, leaping at attackers and knocking them off balance. Bullets ricocheted off the stone structure, but the gateway's hum remained steady, its energy undeterred by the violence. Kenny fought with everything he had, using the terrain to his advantage. One by one, the attackers fell, their numbers thinning. The leader, however, stayed back, watching the battle with a calculating gaze. Finally, only the leader remained. He stepped forward, his weapon trained on Kenny. "You can't stop this, Reeves," he said, his voice cold. "You're out of your depth." Kenny smirked, his chest heaving from exertion. "Maybe. But I've got one thing you don't." "And what's that?" Kenny glanced at the dog, which was now standing beside him, its fur bristling with anticipation. "Back up." Before the leader could react, the dog lunged at him, knocking the weapon from his hands. Kenny rushed forward, tackling him to the ground. A brief struggle ensued, but Kenny's determination won out. He grabbed the leader's weapon and pointed it at him. "It's over," Kenny said. The leader glared at him, but Kenny didn't give him a chance to respond. He knocked him unconscious with the butt of the rifle, then turned back to the gateway. Kenny approached the pedestal, his heart pounding. He knew this was the only way to ensure the artifacts wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. Placing his hand on the tablet, he felt a surge of energy rush through him. The gateway's vortex expanded, its light enveloping the entire clearing. The artifacts began to dissolve, their energies merging with the structure. The pendant around Kenny's neck glowed one last time before crumbling into dust. As the light faded, the gateway stood silent and inert. The artifacts were gone, their power sealed forever. Kenny stepped back, the weight of his actions sinking in. He looked down at the dog, which wagged its tail, its job finally complete. "We did it," Kenny said softly. He glanced at the unconscious leader, then at the now empty pedestal. The fight was over, but the world would never know how close it had come to destruction. With the dog at his side, Kenny turned and walked into the jungle, leading the gateway and the chaos it had brought behind. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. The artifacts were gone, and their secrets were safe. For now, that was enough.